Hello, everyone. My name is Alin Suciu, and I wish you again a warm welcome to another round of the lecture series, Material and Written Culture of Christian Egypt, which is organized once a month under the auspices of the digital edition of the Coptic Old Testament, a project based at the Göttingen Academy, and the Seminar for Egyptology and Coptic Studies at the University of Göttingen. Today we have another distinguished speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Adam Łajtar, who is professor of Greek epigraphy at the University of Warsaw in Poland. In fact, Adam is not only a representative scholar of the University of Warsaw, but he is also a product of that university. He was admitted for his bachelor studies at the University of Warsaw. He earned his MA and PhD there. He did his postdoctoral and habilitation work at the same university, and he currently serves as a professor there, as I mentioned. Today, Adam is one of the most distinguished representatives of the Warsaw School of Nubian Studies, which was founded by the great Kazimierz Michałowski, who was the first Polish scholar who excavated in Sudan at Faras. Later, that is in 1964, the Polish archaeological mission started excavating also in Old Dongola, the capital of the Makurian state, and in this way has begun the Polish hegemony in Nubian studies, a field which is still largely dominated academically by scholars in Warsaw, who continue the tremendous work initiated by Michałowski, Włodzimierz Godlewski, and Stefan Jakobielski. Yet Adam is not only a brilliant field archaeologist, but he is also familiar with deciphering and publishing ancient texts and manuscripts, a skill that he learned from one of the greatest historians and papyrologists, Ewa Wipszycka, who currently is a professor emerita at the University of Warsaw and often attends our lecture series. Adam is thus not simply an armchair specialist in Eastern and African Christianity, like many of us are, but he also works as a field archaeologist, being thus directly involved in the discovery of new monuments and textual sources. His name is particularly connected with the excavations in Old Dongola and Banganarti. For example, he is famous for studying and publishing the large body of Greek and Coptic graffiti from Banganarti. Adam has also done extensive work on the funerary stelae from Nubia, and his work on them has been seminal for understanding these very difficult texts, which must be studied in concert with the superb murals that once adorned the walls of the Nubian churches. I would say that what characterizes Adam's scholarship is the immense breadth of the material he covers. He can work with texts from the Hellenistic and the Roman periods of Egypt, with late medieval Nubian sources. He also participated in excavations in the Balkan region, in Libya, and in Israel. Yet, with all these accomplishments, he remains a very humble and kind person. Today, he will talk about one of his favorite topics, literacy and multilingualism in Nubia. His paper is titled Literacy of Christian Nubia, One Script, three languages, Greek, Coptic, or Nubian. We are all very eager to learn from him about this topic. So without further ado, I will give the word to Adam. Please, Adam.
Thank you, Alin. Thank you for a beautiful introduction. I am a little bit embarrassed by your nice words. So several months ago, while organizing this lecture series, Alin invited me to give a talk about Coptica from Nubia. As you know from his introduction, I am a classicist by training who has been mostly working with Greek texts, and I was a little bit embarrassed by this invitation, and I suggested that instead I could speak about the literacy or literary culture of Christian Nubia as a whole, Coptic texts included. This was accepted by Alin, and so I am talking to you today. I shall begin my talk with a short introduction of the land and its history in Christian times. As you well know, Nubia is the land in the middle part of the Nile Valley to the south of the first cataract, which traditionally was considered as the south border of Egypt. The term Nubia has ethno-linguistic character as it originates from the name of an ethnic group which has inhabited the land in question for more or less 2 millennia. Members of this group call themselves Nubians and speak Nubian languages from the Nilo-Saharan language family. Nubians seems to have arrived in the Nile Valley sometime around the beginning of the Common Era, but they appear prominently in the written sources only in late antiquity, when, taking advantage of the fall of the Meroitic kingdom in the mid-4th century, they formed their own kingdoms. They formed their own kingdoms. These were Nobadia in the north, between the first and the third cataracts, Alwa in the south, below the fifth cataract, and Makuria between them, with its heartland in the Debba bend of the Nile, so here. At a certain point of time, the exact date is debatable and fluctuates between the end of the 6th and the end of the 7th century, Makuria incorporated Nobadia. Starting with this moment, only 2 kingdoms existed in the Middle Nile Valley, Makuria, called Dotawo in internal Nubian sources, in the north, and Alwa in the south. Still before the incorporation of Nobadia by Makuria, Nubian kingdoms received Christianity. The process of Christianization of Nubia is badly known to us. John of Ephesus, a Monophysite bishop and historian of the second half of the 6th century, who is our main source of information in that question, speaks about 3 evangelization missions which were carried out mainly with Egyptian forces and means, though at least partly with the awareness and consent of the imperial court in Constantinople. The first and second missions, which took place in the years 542, 545 and 569, 575 respectively, reached Nobadia. The third one, launched in the 580s, was headed for Alwa. Makuria was most probably Christianized in a separate missionary undertaking, more or less contemporary with the second mission to Nobadia, that is at the turn of 560s to 70s. Nobadia and Alwa received the anti-Chalcedonian version of Christianity. Which version of the Christian faith reached Makuria is a matter of controversy. Scholars of the first half of the 20th century opted for the Chalcedonian confession. The present-day scholarship rather maintains the view that the anti-Chalcedonian faith prevailed there also. Later, after Makuria incorporated Nobadia, their churches merged into one Makurian church, which was unmistakably anti-Chalcedonian, being subordinated to the anti-Chalcedonian Alexandrian Patriarchate. The Christianization of Nubian kingdoms was a factor of the first importance, not only from the religious, but also the cultural point of view. With the Christian faith, Nubians adopted also its cultural baggage, including patterns of literary culture, visual culture, organization of the state, ideology of power, social behavior, and so on. Christian Nubian kingdoms remained alive in the Middle Nile Valley nearly for 1,000 years. In the second half of the 14th century, Makuria split into a series of small chiefdoms as a result of a coincidence of internal and external factors. The traditions of once great Makuria were continued in one of these chiefdoms situated to the north of the Second Cataract. This small Makuria might have existed until the conquest of Lower Nubia by the Ottomans in 1570s. Alwa fell slightly earlier under the invasion of Black Muslim Funj coming from the southeast along the Blue Nile. Its capital, Soba, situated near the confluence of two Niles, was conquered by the Funj warriors in 1506. Christian Nubia had a rich culture, which, with respect to its forms and contents, did not diverge essentially from what we know from other areas of the Oriental Christian world. Its most spectacular element is the multitude of paintings with religious subjects adorning the walls of cult buildings, from big cathedrals to small local churches. Another, less known but equally rich element was literary output. The online database of medieval Nubian texts, launched and maintained by my Warsaw colleague Grzegorz Ochała, contains roughly 4,000 entries, but this should be by no means be understood as an absolute number, as there are still thousands of unpublished texts that need to be entered into it. In the following, I present a tentative picture of Nubian literacy on the basis of the material collected so far in the database. Some figures that I will present to you will inevitably change, some of them even drastically, when the unpublished sources are finally available. The texts produced by Christian Nubians were executed on both durable writing materials such as stone, terracotta, bricks, rock faces, plastered walls, ceramics, and so on, and on non-durable ones such as papyrus, parchment, paper, leather, textiles, and so on. Both groups involve different kinds of media, the most popular being stelae, but of stone and terracotta, walls, manuscripts, ostraca, pottery vessels. Others, like metal objects, jewelry, clay stoppers, stamps, textiles, are found only occasionally. The durable materials are by far more popular than the non-durable ones. For example, the database includes nearly 1,000 stelae and nearly 2,000 wall and rock inscriptions in comparison to 300 manuscripts on perishable materials. Textual finds originate from the entire territory of Nubia, from the first cataract in the north to the confluence of two Niles in the south. They are slightly more numerous in the north than in the south, but this might be simply connected with the state of research. Lower Nubia is well recognized archaeologically, thanks to extensive research campaigns connected with hydrological projects. More importantly, inscriptions and generally texts tend to occur in well-defined centers. Going from north to south, one has to mention in the first place Kasibrim. Kasibrim is here. It was an important religious, commercial, administrative, and military center situated on the right bank of the Nile, more or less midway between the first and the second Nile cataracts. Kasr-Brim probably fulfilled the functions of a capital for the independent kingdom of Nobadia, and later, at least temporarily, for the province of Nobadia within the kingdom of Makuria. It was a bishopric see from the beginning, from the time of Christianization in the 6th century until at least the last quarter of the 15th century. Located on a rocky outcrop rising circa 60 meters above the level of the Nile, it was kept safe from being flooded by the waters of the Nubia Lake, which allowed archaeological investigations to be carried out there by a mission of the Egypt Exploration Society between 1963 and 2008. The photo shows Kasr-Brim as an island in the Nubia Lake. What is seen in the center of the photo is the Cathedral of Kasr-Brim. The excavations abounded in manuscript finds. I'm showing some manuscripts from British excavations in Kasr-Brim. This is a portion of a codex with a martyrdom of St. George, eulogy of Michael in Old Nubian, and single sheet of paper with an alphabetic hymn to Mary. So the excavations abounded in manuscript finds, but yielded also several hundred of inscriptions, including in particular a rich collection of epitaphs and visitors' graffiti in the rocky sanctuary of Jebel Maktoub, situated circa 2 kilometers east of the town. Further on, one has to name Sakinia, a locality on the west bank of the Nile, southwest of Kasr-Brim, with an extensive cemetery, which alone yielded over 300 epitaphs in Coptic and some in Greek. Next in sequence is Faras, an important center of occupation in the Second Cataract area, which, either as an alternative to Kasr-Brim or simultaneously with it, fulfilled the functions of the capital for Nobadia, first as an independent kingdom and later as a province of the kingdom of Makuria. It was a bishopric see from more or less 630 until at least the end of the 14th century. The agglomeration of Faras encompassed a fortified town on the west shore of the river, extramural habitations encircling the citadel on all sides except for the east, and extensive cemeteries on the edge of the desert. The center of the town was occupied by the cathedral, adorned with magnificent paintings discovered by Polish archaeologists during the Nubian campaign of the 1960s. 2 kilometers north of the town, in the locality called Castle-Wyss, there was a monastery of Dioscoros, most probably the main monastic establishment of the agglomeration, and to the west of it, the so-called Anchorite Grotto, apparently a place of solitude for a holy monk of the Castle-Wyss monastic community. All these sites, taken together, yielded several hundred inscriptions, which obviously fall in two groups, namely stone inscriptions, mostly epitaphs, and wall inscriptions in the cathedral and other churches, the Castle-Wyss monastery and the Anchorite Grotto. In addition, we have some manuscripts, including the famous Castle-Wyss Codex, a complete book containing 2 works in Coptic, namely Words of the Savior under the cross and Dance of the Savior around the cross. Further on, one has to name Sonkitino, a locality some 70 kilometers to the south of the Second Cataract, within the limits of the Faras bishopric. San Kitino boasted a small church unearthed by the Italian team during the Nubian campaign of the 1960s, whose walls, as you've seen on the photo, were densely covered with wall inscriptions, mostly dipinti in black ink left by visitors. Still farther to the south, worth of mention is Dongola, the capital of the Kingdom of Makuria and the seat of the head of the Makurian Church, who is designated as an archbishop in sources at our disposal. Seated on the east bank of the river, the agglomeration of Dongola encompassed an upper town enclosed with massive defensives, extramural structures, and cemeteries situated on the fringe of the desert. Dongola has been subject of archaeological work by a Polish mission since 1963 or 64, as Alin mentioned. The excavations brought to light a big residential building believed to be the palace of Makurian kings, habitation quarters, an area of workshops, and numerous sacral buildings. Of them, the most important is a monastery hidden under the so-called Com Age, located more or less 1.5 kilometers to the north of the town. The textual crop of excavations is very rich with respect to both the number of finds and their quality. It includes nearly 1,000 inscriptions on stone and terracotta stelae, walls of buildings, and various objects, especially pottery vessels. Interestingly, for reasons that are not quite clear to us, Dongola yielded only a very few manuscripts. Next in line is Banganarti, a small fortified settlement 10 kilometers to the south of Dongola, excavated by a Polish mission since 2002. Two successive churches, one standing atop the other. They are marked as red and black on the plan you see. The earlier church is the red one. Two churches, one standing atop the other, occupied the center of the settlement. The lower church yielded a not very rich but extremely interesting collection of wall dipinti with texts of hymns for the Great Land, and the upper church as many as 970 graffiti left by believers who visited this cult place. Some photos showing the abundance of graffiti in the upper church at Banganarti. Finally, one has to mention Hazali, a monastery situated deep in a wadi in the area of the Fourth Cataract. The monastery was researched in the 1960s by a mission from the Syrian Antiquities Service and recently by a mission of the Polish Center of Mediterranean Archaeology. The epigraphic crop of this research includes over 200 epitaphs on stone and terracotta stelae, some of them found in situ, some wall graffiti on the walls of the church, and nearly 1,000 graffiti on pottery. If the Christian Nubian textual finds have a more or less even distribution in space, they do not have an even distribution in time. They are relatively rare in the 6th, 7th century. Their number rises drastically in the 8th century to remain on more or less the same high level until the 13th century, and then falls in a rather abrupt manner in the 14th, 15th century. You see this on the graphs. This curve essentially covers with the periodization of the Christian Nubian culture suggested by archaeologists. 6th, 7th centuries correspond with the so-called early period when the Nubian state and church were still in the process of formation. 8th, 13th century is the so-called classical period, or the golden age of Makuria, as one scholar put it. And 14th, 15th centuries correspond with the late period, which is the period of decline and fall of the Christian Nubian culture, including the literacy. Some traditional kinds of inscriptions, as for example epitaphs, were produced any longer in the late period, and the epigraphic production of this time is represented actually by only one category of inscriptions, namely visitors' graffiti in cult places. Texts in Christian Nubia were essentially composed in three languages: Greek, Coptic, and Old Nubian. Please note that while using the term Coptic, I always mean Sahidic Coptic. Texts in other dialects are extremely rare in Nubia and have no relevance for the present talk. All three languages made use of the same alphabet. As you know very well, Coptic alphabet was built upon the Greek alphabet with additional letters for sounds that do not occur in Greek, and Old Nubian alphabet was constructed on the basis of the Coptic one with three additional signs representing sounds that were not found in Coptic. Until the end of the first millennium, different script styles were in use depending on the character of the text, either a monumental commemorative inscription or a graffito or a document, and partly on the language. Starting with the 11th century, all three languages made use of the same script, the so-called Nubian type majuscules, based on the Upper Egyptian version of the inclined ogival majuscules. As a consequence, texts produced in Christian Nubia between the 11th and the 15th centuries are undistinguishable linguistically solely on visual basis. As an illustration, I am showing you a letter sent by Makurian King Moses George to the Alexandrian Patriarch Mark. The date of the letter is 1187. The letter is essentially in Coptic, but the addresses are in Greek. All this is written by one hand in the same type of script, so-called Old Nubian or Nubian type majuscules. In what follows, I shall give some characteristics of the textual production of Christian Nubia, basing on linguistic principles. I shall start with Greek. Introduced still in the pagan phase of the Nubian kingdoms and reinforced by Christianization, Greek remained in use almost until the end of the independent Nubian Christian statehood. The youngest surely dated Greek text connected with Makuria is a wall inscription in Deir Anbahadra near Aswan, left on 7 April 1322 by Joseph, bishop of an unknown Makurian see. Some Greek graffiti in the upper church at Banganarti could be still younger. For example, an inscription commemorating Paper, a small king of Dongola, which on account of royal titles should be dated probably to the period after the fall of Great Makuria, that is second half of the 14th, first half of the 15th century. Greek was the primary sacred language of medieval Christian Makurians. By sacred language, I understand a language used in religious discourse that is in and around sacral practices. Greek was the principal language of the performative part of the liturgy, including the divine liturgy, liturgy of the presanctified gifts, baptismal liturgy, and the funeral liturgy. The only testimony of the use of another language than Greek in the performative part of the liturgy is a parchment leaf from the Castle Wyss Monastery with prayers from the baptismal liturgy in Coptic. Greek is the main language attested for the creeds, a kind of text closely related to liturgy too. The photo shows the Constantinopolitan creed found in the monastery church on Com 8 in Dongola. The musical side of the liturgy is represented entirely by finds in Greek. More or less 30 texts on parchment leaves, walls of churches and ostraca, composed in the best tradition of late antique, early Byzantine hymnography. The photo shows a page of a codex found by Polish mission in Faras, with a collection of hymns, including the famous Troparion Eltchen Hosoter Cimeron. A notable exception are inscriptions protruding from the mouths of the participants of a ritual represented on a wall of the so-called southwest annex of the monastery on Com H in Dongola, which contain acclamations sung in honor of the Virgin. They obviously represent a late tradition contrasting with an earlier Mediterranean one. Oh no, this is not the photo that this is the photo that I wanted to show you. You see a mural representing a feast whose participants sing songs in Old Nubian. By the way, the previous photo shows a magnificent representation of Archangel Michael in one of the rooms of the northwest annex of the monastery on Com H in Dongola, with hymns to Michael in Greek. Among some 400 epitaphs in Greek known to date, there are 76 items with the prayer, God of spirits and all flesh, you who have defeated death and trodden down Hades, and so on. And 9 epitaphs with the prayer, God of spirits and flesh, all visible and invisible things. Both these prayers are attested as elements of the liturgy for the dead in the Byzantine Church, and it is nearly certain that this was their original place in the Makurian Church too. Thus, we would have indication that the funeral liturgy was held in Greek in the Makurian Church. Other Greek epitaphs also made use of liturgical phrases, even if not so straightforwardly. Generally speaking, Makurian epitaphs in Greek frequently display a sophisticated language, sometimes echoing antique models. Greek is attested as the language of religious literature. The database lists 38 examples, including 20 biblical texts, 7 hagiographies, and 1 homily. The genre of further 10 cannot be identified. This literature was copied and used for a number of different purposes: for edifying reading, both in privacy and in public, for example, during a liturgy, as apotropaia, as decorative elements, and so on. Greek is also found in private prayers and acclamations, inscriptions left by visitors in sacred spaces, and inscriptions accompanying painted representation in churches. The latter category includes captions of paintings, as here. This is the row of apostles in one of the rooms of the northwest annex to the monastery in Dongola. We have captions of the paintings and the so-called dedications of paintings that are prayers for the donor, composed of a series of requests arranged in a firm order and addressed to Jesus Christ. Here we have such a dedication from the Faras Cathedral on the left and from the newly discovered Church of Raphael in the citadel of Dongola. Finally, we know several magic spells showing elements of Greek language, in addition to magic names and magic signs, which are linguistically neutral. Sorry, this is not this. This is a magical ostracon from Jebel Adda that has some elements of Greek. Outside the sacral sphere, Greek is attested only in ostraca with receipts for shipment of grain. Several items of this kind are known from the area of the Second Cataract. One example of a similar nature was found in Dongola, and this is the ostracon from Dongola, which mentions amounts of corn which should be shipped. Greek occurs also in painted addresses on ceramic transport containers, that is, in a context resembling that of the shipment ostraca. Both the ostraca and the containers with tituli picti can be dated to the 6th, 8th century on archaeological and paleographic grounds, which suggests that the use of Greek for commercial and administrative purposes in Makuria was restricted to the early Christian times. It might have followed Egyptian models of late antique date. Now let us pass on to Coptic. First attestation of Sahidic Coptic in the Middle Nile Valley are dated to the period of 3 kingdoms, that is 5th, 6th century. These are letters to Nubadian rulers found in Kasribrim and commemorative inscriptions in churches installed in pagan temples, as for example the inscription commemorating the conversion of the temple of Dendur into a Christian church. The character of these earliest sources is basically retained in subsequent centuries when we find both texts commemorating the erection of buildings, for example, the foundation inscription of Bishop Paul from Pharas. This is the photo. The inscription is dated to 707. And in addition to such monumental inscriptions, we have letters, for example, unpublished correspondence from the time of King Kyriakos from Kasribrim, dating to the 8th century. To these traditional categories, other categories, especially religious texts, were added in later centuries. Thus, the first and more foremost category of Coptic sources from the Middle Nile Valley are funerary stelae found throughout the kingdom of Makuria, from Kalapsha in the north to El Koro in the south. I am showing you Coptic epitaph from Ghazali. The photo shows it in situ. As a matter of fact, Coptic epitaphs are much more numerous, or are more numerous than Greek epitaphs. We have 480, according to the database, we have 480 Coptic epitaphs and 370 Greek ones. While this difference is made up mainly by 2 cemeteries, where the use of Coptic was overwhelming, Sakinia in the north and Ghazali in the south, the resulting percentage, that is 56 Coptic and 44% Greek, is representative for the majority of cemeteries where Greek and Coptic monuments occurred side by side. Recent studies on funerary monuments from the southernmost sites where Coptic is attested, namely Ghazali and El Koro, challenge the common opinion that the use of this language, I mean Sahidic Coptic, was restricted to the north, the former kingdom of Nubadia, and its occurrence in the south, that is the heartland of Makuria, is exceptional and must be connected with the presence of an Egyptian community. In my opinion, regional differences in the use of Coptic highlighted by previous scholarship are of much lesser importance than the general character of the site where the language is present. Thus, monastic sites, be it Castle Luis in the north or Ghazali in the south, are more likely to produce Coptic texts, while Dongola, the seat of the state and church administration, is definitely more Greekized. Nota bene, in Dongola, Coptic texts occur only in the monastery and Comm age. Of course, regional differences are not to be totally discarded, as it was the north that maintained more lively contacts with Egypt, especially Upper Egypt. Another important category of Nubian written sources in Coptic are documents. The database lists 42 such examples, including 20 legal texts, 8 letters, 2 documents of economic character, and the remaining ones have not been published so far, or their character cannot be determined. All of them come from the north, from Ichmindi, Kasribrim, Debeira West, Abdelgadir, and Kasselwis. This category of texts allows for another observation concerning the use of Coptic in Christian Nubia, again in opposition to common opinions, namely that Coptic was not only the language of literature, but also the language of business, law, and internal and external written communication until its disappearance in the 11th century. The third major category of Coptic Nubian written sources are literary texts. 61 examples are registered in the database, all of them of religious nature. 24 fragments of the Bible, 18 hagiographies, 3 homilies, 3 apocrypha, and 3 patristic texts. The character of the remaining 11 cannot be established. This collection will rise substantially after the publication of numerous and generically diversified Coptica from Kasselbrim, now under preparation by Jost Hagen, and less numerous but equally interesting Coptic finds from Kasselwies, studied by Alexandros Tsakos. Even without finds from Kasselbrim and Kasselwies, all the major genres of religious literature are represented in Coptic, which indeed supports the statement of Coptic as a literary language of Christian Nubians. An interesting piece of evidence in this context is a fragment of a typicon with readings for several days in the month of Faofi, found in Kasselbrim. The typicon is composed in Greek for rubrics and Coptic for incipits and explicits of readings from the Psalms, Pauline epistles, and Gospels. The existence of this typicon implies that there existed complete Bible manuscripts in Coptic, from which entire readings were recited during the Mass. This is so the more so interesting as, for example, we do not know psalms in Coptic from Christian Nubia, but the typicon testifies to the fact that such Coptic books existed. Apart from the 3 categories of text discussed above, Coptic occasionally occurs in other types of sources, like captions to paintings, visitors' inscriptions, and private prayers. However, these groups of sources are too small, or the number of Coptic texts within them is too low to allow any more detailed analysis. Sahidic Coptic went out of use as the living language of written communication in Christian Nubia at more or less the same time as in Egypt, that is, in the 11th century. 3 examples from the 12th century, the letter of King Moses Georgios to Patriarch Mark of Alexandria, found in Kasselbrim. I showed you already the photo of this letter, and 2 texts inscribed on the walls of the crypt of Bishop Georgios in Dongola. This was, by the way, a document in Coptic coming from somewhere in North Nubia, and dating from 8th to 9th century. There are 2 texts inscribed on the walls of the crypt of Bishop Georgios in Dongola. I'm showing you the crypt, showed that the knowledge of this language, very good at that, was cultivated at least in the 12th century, at least in the milieus of the capital of Makuria. And finally, Nubian. Nubian was the language of oral communication among the Nubians and their Nubianized subjects. At a point in time, the language obtained a written form. The oldest indubitable attestation of the existence of written Nubian are Nubian glosses in the epitaph of the priest Istefanu from Dongola, dated 797. This does not mean, however, that written Nubian was created only at this relatively late date. I'm convinced that this culturally important innovation was introduced much earlier, already in the time of the Christianization of Nubian kingdoms, as one of the means of propagation of the new faith among their inhabitants, and that the oldest pieces of the literacy in Nubian, dating from the time between the second half of the 6th and the second half of the 8th century simply were not preserved. For such a view speaks the comparison with other ethnic groups Christianized in the frame of the Eastern Roman religious policy, for example, Armenians or Georgians or later Slavs, which obtained their own alphabets in the Christianization package. Another argument for the early dating of the Nubian alphabet is that the additional signs for sounds typical of Northeast Sudanic were designed on the basis of appropriate signs in the Meroitic cursive script, which presupposes its knowledge at least to a certain extent, and this was of course definitely more probable in the 6th century than in the 8th century. On the other side of the chronological axis, Nubian script was still used in the second half of the 15th century, as proven by legal documents on parchments and inscriptions on the walls of sacral buildings dating from the time of King Yoel, who ruled Makuria, reduced the area between Kasribrim and the Second Cataract in the second half of the 15th century. Testimonies of written Nubian are rare before the end of the first millennium and consist mainly of Nubian glosses in Greek texts. Starting with the 11th century, their number increases rapidly to reach the peak in the 12th century. At present, several hundred texts in Nubian are known, originating from the entire territory of the Kingdom of Makuria. They can be divided in 3 major categories: literary texts, documents and letters, and informal inscriptions. Literary texts are mostly of religious character. The large majority of them are translations from Greek, more rarely from Coptic. Among them, one finds biblical books, more often from the New Testament than from the Old Testament, lectionaries, homilies, hagiographies, and other holy texts. Biblical and homiletic texts apparently had liturgical destination. They were read during the liturgy of the word, which, in contrast to the performative part of the liturgy held in Greek, was held in the epichoric language. A similar situation might have existed with hagiographic texts. Their reciting was an important element of commemorative ceremonies held on the days of saints' feasts. The only original literary creations of religious nature in Nubian are prayers left by individuals in cult places. Significantly, there are no epitaphs in Nubian, except for Nubian code switchings in Greek epitaphs and a mixed Greco-Nubian epitaph of King Georgios, which interestingly was found not in Nubia, but in Wadi Natrun. This King George died 1157. Among Kasribrim finds, there are fragments of horoscopes in Old Nubian, and from Jebel Adda we know a lunary in Old Nubian, a lunary which is a calendar of prognostics for the 30 days of the lunar month. The category of documents clearly splits into 2 groups, legal and administrative. The former group includes contracts of sale, mainly of land, but also slaves, cessions of land, releases of slaves, and depositions. In the latter category, one finds royal decrees, orders from high officials, lists of holdings, and accounts. Letters are both official, exchanged between persons of rank and dealing with state matters, and private. Legal documents were drafted according to a firm scheme comprising invocation of God, protocol listing the most important officials of central and local administration, body of the deed, and list of witnesses. The same structure is found in earlier Coptic documents. Obviously, Nubian replaced Coptic as the legal language of Makuria, and Nubian notarial tradition followed an earlier Coptic tradition. Informal inscriptions are mostly visitors' mementos left by believers in cult places. From the formal and semantic point of view, they follow the tradition of similar inscriptions in Greek and Coptic. The Nubian language of medieval Makurian texts is frequently called Old Nubian, sometimes also medieval Nubian, to distinguish it from modern Nubian languages spoken in the Nile Valley. The relation of Old Nubian to these modern languages is described in various ways in the scholarship. According to one hypothesis, Old Nubian is just an earlier form of the present-day Nubian, the Nubian language spoken between the second and the third Nile cataracts. This, however, seems to be an oversimplification. More properly, it should probably be designated as a literary language, a written variety which coexisted with at least two spoken varieties corresponding with Old Nubian and Old Dongolawi, whereby Old Nubian would be closer to the former, that is to Old Nubian. Elements of these spoken varieties are detectable in informal inscriptions, for instance, those from Banganarti and in the onomastics. Alin, how much time do I still have?
You can continue, just take your time.
Thank you very much. The use in Christian Makuria of three languages in largely overlapping contexts caused the languages to interact. The interaction is mirrored in mixed language texts, code switching, borrowing of vocabulary, and adoption of other language features. As far as mixed language texts are concerned, the most interesting examples are yielded by poetic works of the Old Testament, that is, psalms and odes, inscribed in both parchment codices, wooden tablets, and inscriptions on the walls of sacral buildings. Their verses are frequently given one after the other in two language versions. This is full bilingualism, all alternate linguistically. That is, the first is in Greek, the second is in Old Nubian, the third is in Greek, the fourth is in Old Nubian, and so on, which can be called semi-bilingualism. I'm showing you a sheet of a page of a codex found in Dongola with Ode 8. This is the Song of Three Youths in the Fire Furnace, which exactly has this semi-bilingual phenomenon. This particular linguistic phenomenon may reflect the singing performance of those texts. For example, during a liturgical celebration by two choirs, of which one sang Greek and the other Nubian. There are 18 mixed language epitaphs known to us, either Greco-Coptic or Greco-Nubian. As an example of the former one can cite the epitaph of Joseph, Bishop of Aswan, who died 668 or 670 in Dongola, in which the introductory formula and the final dating lemma are in Greek, and the prayer for the deceased, including the biographic information about him, is in Coptic. The latter, I mean the Greco-Nubian bilingual text or epitaph, are best represented by the epitaph of the Makurian king Georgios mentioned above, which essentially was edited in Nubian, but has an additional prayer in Greek. Interestingly, we do not possess Coptic Nubian epitaphs, perhaps because the use of these two languages does not overlap chronologically. Another interesting example of mixed language texts are letters. The great majority of letters known from Makuria, both official and private, are in Nubian, but their addresses are in Greek, recognizable thanks to Greek flexional endings of nouns, Greek names of offices, and the Greek article to. This is the article of masculine dative masculine, used to introduce the addressee. Similarly, the Coptic letter of King Moses Georgios to Mark, Patriarch of Alexandria, has two Greek subscripts with an elaborated titulature of both the sender and the addressee. The use of Greek in addressees may be a remnant from the time, possibly as distant as the period of Three Kingdoms, where Greek was the language of correspondence. Code switching, that is, alternating between two or more languages in the context of a single statement, is attested for the pairs Greek Coptic and inversely, and Greek Nubian and inversely. Code switching between Coptic and Nubian has no attestations in the published textual material. Code switching is best observable in epitaphs and inscriptions left by visitors in cult places. As for the epitaphs, the code may be switched while passing from the prayer for the deceased soul, that is something formulaic, to the information about the deceased, including his or her filiation, the length of his or her life, and the date of his or her death, that is something individual. If the former is in Greek, the latter, this individual information, may be in Coptic or in Old Nubian. In visitors' inscriptions, which of all products of Makurian literacy are most closely related to the everyday language, code switching is very common. As a rule, it is intrasentential, and the sentence mostly affected by it is "I so and so wrote this." In it, the subject in one language, the Greek ego, the Nubian I, or the Coptic anok, can be connected with the predicate in another, the Greek egrapsa or the Nubian paiselo. There are also examples of intra-word switching, for example, when nouns obtain Coptic articles in Greek linguistic context. Lexical borrowings are rather uncommon in the written texts. In Greek and Coptic sources, they actually are restricted to a few Nubian names of offices. In Nubian texts, they are more numerous and more diverse in both generic and semantic respects. The Old Nubian Dictionary, compiled by Gerald Michael Brown, has 1,040 entries. Of them, 110, this is 10%, are loanwords, 77 Greek, 24 Egyptian, and 9 Arabic. The rest probably belongs to the original Northeast Sudanic stock. The percentage is rather small when compared with, for example, Coptic or English, the vocabularies of which consist of borrowings in several dozens %. The relative lexical purity of medieval Nubian shows that the language was shaped in an isolated environment and only at a later stage of its development started to incorporate words of foreign origin into its vocabulary. In this context, it is important to observe that the Greek loanwords in Nubian are connected mostly, if not exclusively, with the Christian faith, Christian cult, and the cultural activity. Except for lexical borrowings, Nubian of medieval texts is relatively free of external influences, either Greek or Coptic. The same holds true for Nubian Coptic. A different situation is observed with relation to Greek, which under the influence of the epichoric language underwent far-reaching changes during the millennium of its use in Makuria. Results of these changes are best visible in late visitors' inscriptions, some such as those from the upper church at Banganarti or Joseph's di Pinto from the Jan Bahadra near Aswan. The changes affected equally phonetics, morphology, and syntax, and are also detectable in the graphic form of the language. As for phonetic changes, one can cite a substitution of r for d, and inversely, a phenomenon impossible within Indo-European languages, but common in Northeast Sudanic. As for morphology, one notes a complete collapse of the Greek declension system. The phenomenon is best seen in the treatment of the first person singular pronoun, that is I. All its forms, both nominative and oblique cases, were used, irrespective of the actual grammatical context, as allomorphs of the same word meaning I. Syntactical changes went towards establishing a fixed word order, otherwise rather free in Greek, which eventually led to Nubian Greeks becoming a positional language, or nearly a positional language. A good illustration of that is found in genitival expressions, in which the word order is always rectum regens, with rectum not marked morphologically as genitive. To conclude, the surprisingly rich and generically diversified textual output of Christian Nubia prompts us to ask the question how the knowledge of letters was transmitted and disseminated in the Middle Nile Valley in Christian times. Some clues for answering this question were yielded by the Polish work in Dongola. A refuse dump just behind the southeast corner of the monastery church produced some 20 ostraca inscribed with what we can describe as school exercises. One of them had a complete Coptic alphabet written in columns, another the names of three most popular archangels, Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael, written in a very unskillful hand, no doubt that of a pupil. The most common, however, are exercises in declension, whereby the word used, rather unexpectedly, is the adjective abrochos, non-inundated, obviously because of the local environment. One also finds ostraca with the so-called chains or pangrams, artificial words containing all 24 letters of the Greek alphabet repeated only once each. In the church itself, the preserved lower part of the east wall of the south aisle is entirely covered by inscriptions of similar kind, including, in the first line, alphabetical lists of words. The largest of these inscriptions has as many as 12 lists, covering the letters from lambda to psi. Each list consists of 7 entries arranged according to the vowels of the Greek alphabet. Finally, one must mention an ink inscription in the northwest annex with an adaptation of one of the sentences ascribed to Menander, a Greek poet of the late 4th, early 3rd century BC. The text says, this is my copy of the inscription, the text says that those who know script, perhaps in the sense of Holy Scripture, have a better understanding than other people. The exercises listed above correspond with the successive steps of literary education in Greek style, from learning letters to constructing words and memorizing vocabulary, followed by style training. They are attested in exactly the same form in Greek papyri and ostraca from Hellenistic, Roman, and late antique Egypt, and also from elsewhere. This means that the literary education in Christian Nubia followed paths which had been established in the Greek and Greek-influenced world for nearly 2 millennia. In this respect, the Christian culture of the Nile Valley, Middle Nile Valley, was a direct heir of Greco-Roman civilization. Thank you very much for your attention.